He slid the review across the desk, smiling like a man who had just snapped my spine without leaving his chair. I glanced at the slashed salary once, then folded the page like a cheap receipt. He thought he was teaching me fear. He did not know that 3 weeks ago, I began measuring how much of his empire was held up by my hands. By the time he realizes he cut his only lifeline, it will be too late. My name is Juliana Walker. I am 37 years old, and for the last 9 years, I have served as the Senior Director of Operations at Beacon Row Live. To the outside world, Beacon Row is a premier powerhouse for corporate events. We produce massive investment roadshows, high-stakes medical tech conferences, and luxury brand activations that span across multiple states. We are the people who turn an empty, echoing convention hall into a multi-million-dollar experience overnight. But behind the glossy brochures and the perfectly edited promotional videos, the reality is entirely different. The reality is a house of cards, and I have been the one standing in the center of the room, holding my breath so it does not collapse. I am the one who remembers which keynote speaker requires a green room kept at exactly 68 degrees. I am the one who negotiates with unions at 2 a.m. when a rigging crew threatens to walk off the job. I absorb the panic, filter out the noise, and deliver perfection. I handle the grueling, invisible machinery of the business so my boss, Graham Pike, can stand on a brightly lit stage in a tailored suit, shaking hands with venture capitalists and taking the credit. Today was supposed to be my annual review. I walked into Graham's corner office on the top floor, a room practically dripping with excessive corporate vanity. He had recently insisted on importing Italian leather furniture and installing a custom wet bar. Expenses he claimed were strictly for client optics. I sat down across from him, expecting the usual exhausting routine. I anticipated he would complain about the rising costs of freight shipping. I would present the 50-page spreadsheet proving I had just saved us $200,000 on vendor contracts, and we would eventually settle on a modest single-digit percentage raise. Instead, Graham did not open my performance file. He simply smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile, the kind of expression a man wears when he believes he holds absolute power. Slowly, deliberately, he slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the smooth mahogany surface of his desk. I picked it up. My eyes scanned the black ink, immediately snagging on the only line that mattered. It was a formal amendment to my employment contract. My base salary, the number I had painstakingly negotiated, the number I had earned through countless 90-hour work weeks, canceled vacations, and sleepless nights had been slashed by exactly 50%. I stopped breathing for one fraction of a second. I looked up at him. Graham was leaning back in his oversized executive chair, his fingers steepled together resting against his chin. His face wore a carefully practiced mask of grave corporate necessity, but his eyes betrayed him completely. They were gleaming with a sick, eager light. It was a look that hovered dangerously between a threat and a thrill. He had orchestrated this exact moment. I could see it in his posture. He was waiting for the shock to paralyze me. He was waiting for my breath to hitch, waiting for my eyes to well up with tears, waiting for the inevitable, messy crack in my professional composure. He desperately wanted me to break. He wanted me to ask how I was supposed to pay my mortgage on half my income. He wanted me to raise my voice, to slam my hands on the desk, to threaten to quit right then and there. If I lost control, he would win. He would have the ultimate satisfaction of telling me I was acting hysterical, that I was entirely replaceable, and that I should be on my knees thanking him for allowing me to keep my desk at all. He wanted to trigger a complete emotional breakdown so he could justify breaking my spirit even further. "Cost restructuring," Graham said, finally breaking the silence. He let the hollow corporate buzzword hang in the heavy air of the office. The board and I had to make some incredibly tough calls this quarter. Juliana, we are pivoting, moving toward leaner operations. Every single department has to bleed a little bit if we want to stay competitive in this aggressive market. Every department. The audacity of the lie almost made me laugh. I knew the operational budget better than I knew my own mother's face. I knew exactly how much capital he had just authorized for a ridiculous velvet-roped VIP lounge at a venue in Dallas, a lounge no client had ever requested. I knew the exorbitant monthly retainer he had just signed for a boutique vanity public relations firm just to get his own name in industry magazines. The company was not bleeding because of the market. He was just draining my veins to water his own ego and cover his reckless financial tracks. I felt a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. The heat of pure, concentrated humiliation flared in my chest. Every instinct I possessed demanded that I crumple the paper into a ball and throw it directly at his smug face. But I forced the heat down. I swallowed it whole and locked it away in a cold, airtight vault in the back of my mind. Emotion is a luxury you absolutely cannot afford when a mediocre man is actively trying to destroy your livelihood. I did not argue with him. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even ask him the word why. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my voice entirely flat, stripping away any inflection that he could possibly interpret as weakness, panic, or anger. "Effective when?" I asked. Graham blinked hard. The question visibly caught him off guard. He had prepared for a drawn-out, emotional war of attrition, and instead, I had handed him a clipboard with a scheduling question. He leaned forward abruptly, the smug superiority faltering for just a fraction of a second before he hastily plastered it back onto his face. "Immediately," he said, his tone turning a little sharper, his volume rising just a fraction as if he were trying to force his dominance back into the center of the room. "Starting this current pay period." I looked down at the piece of paper one more time. I memorized the exact, jagged ink strokes of his signature resting at the bottom of the page. Then, I folded the document exactly in half, matching the edges perfectly, and slipped it into the front pocket of my tailored blazer. "Good," I said, meeting his gaze with absolute, deadpan calm. "Then the timing is perfect." A profound, heavy silence stretched across the mahogany desk. I watched the gears grinding behind his eyes. He was scrambling to decode my response. Was I in a state of deep psychological denial? Was it a pathetic, desperate attempt to save face after a crushing defeat? I could practically see his ego settle comfortably on the latter option. Men like Graham Pike always believe that a woman's silence is either an admission of submission or a symptom of shock. It never once crosses their minds that silence might actually be a calculated strategy. "I am very glad you are being a professional about this difficult transition, Juliana," he said, though the absolute certainty in his voice had vanished. "We really need everyone rowing in the exact same direction right now." "I have always been a professional, Graham," I replied smoothly, standing up from the chair. "I will get back to work." I turned my back on him and walked to the door. I did not storm out. I did not slam the heavy wooden door behind me. I closed it with a soft, decisive, and final click. Walking down the long hallway, past the glass-walled conference rooms and the chaotic energy of the open-plan bullpen, I kept my hand resting over the folded piece of paper in my pocket. Employees were rushing past me, carrying stacks of lanyards, shouting into headsets. Completely oblivious to what had just occurred, they thought I was just returning from a standard performance review. They were wrong. I was not walking away from a review. I was walking out of the blast radius of a detonation that Graham had just foolishly triggered directly under his own feet. He genuinely thought he was just cutting the company's expenses and putting an uppity female executive in her place. He was completely blind to the reality. He did not realize he had just taken a knife and severed the absolute only functional lifeline keeping his entire sinking ship from crashing violently into the rocks. I maintained my rigid posture, nodding politely to a passing account manager, until I finally cleared the double glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the suffocating afternoon heat. I walked across the scorching asphalt of the parking lot, my heels clicking methodically against the pavement, and got into my car. The moment the heavy car door slammed shut, sealing me inside the quiet, insulated cabin, the massive wave of adrenaline finally began to recede, but it did not leave behind fear or despair. It left behind a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I gripped the leather steering wheel with both hands until my knuckles turned stark white. Still, I did not cry. Crying was a biological response reserved for things you had lost and desperately wanted back. I did not want Beacon Row Live back. I wanted it to burn to the ground. I took a deep breath, reached into my leather tote bag, and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale, steady glow against the dim interior of the car. I ignored the immediate flood of urgent notifications, 3 missed calls from a panicked venue coordinator in Chicago, 5 text messages from a lighting vendor demanding updated schematics, and a calendar alert for a production meeting. Instead, I opened my personal email application. I bypassed the spam and the promotional offers, scrolling down with a steady thumb until I found a specific message I had received exactly 3 weeks ago. It was an email from Mara Sloan. She was the brilliant, aggressive founder of Astor Loop Studio, the rising competitor agency that Graham constantly mocked in public but secretly feared in private. The subject line was simple, direct, and uncharacteristically formal: confidential inquiry regarding your future. 3 weeks ago, when that email first landed in my inbox, I had left it entirely unread. I had been bound by a stubborn, foolish sense of loyalty to a company I had literally helped build from the dirt up. I had genuinely believed my grueling hard work would eventually be recognized. I had believed that the late nights, the missed birthdays, and the countless corporate disasters I had averted would amount to something much more than a patronizing pat on the back. But Graham Pike had just given me the exact market price of my loyalty. It was worth exactly 50% less than it was 24 hours ago. I stared at the glowing screen, tracing the letters of Mara's name with my eyes. This was no longer just an ignored, unread email sitting in my inbox. It was the architectural blueprint for my permanent exit. It was the single spark that was going to ignite the powder keg Graham had so carelessly built around himself. I tapped the screen and opened the message. For nearly 9 years, I have been the structural integrity of Beacon Row Live. My business cards read Senior Director of Operations, a title that suggests I manage spreadsheets, approve vacation days, and perhaps oversee a team of mid-level managers. The truth is far more granular, far more exhausting, and infinitely less glamorous. I am the human mortar holding the bricks of this agency together. Without me, the entire edifice crumbles into a pile of expensive dust. Graham Pike operates entirely in the realm of optics. He is the man who thrives in the spotlight, the one who effortlessly glides across the ballroom floor with a flute of champagne, clapping venture capitalists on the back and posing for photographs against step-and-repeat backdrops. He speaks in sweeping visions, synergy, and market disruption. But if you were to ask him about the critical deadline for submitting the electrical grid layout to the fire marshal in Austin, or the specific municipal permits required to erect a 3-story temporary structure in downtown Chicago, his eyes would glaze over. He does not know how the engine works. He only likes to drive the car and wave at the crowd from the driver's seat. My domain is the subterranean machinery of the business. I know the things that actually keep the lights on. I know that the chief marketing officer at Halcyon Health Devices will unconditionally reject any proposal that uses the word disruptive, and that she prefers phone calls strictly between 8 and 9 in the morning on Tuesdays. I know that the loading dock manager at the primary convention center in Las Vegas will conveniently lose our freight if we do not send a box of premium cigars to his office exactly 1 week before load-in. I know that Marcus, the gruff, unyielding foreman for our preferred rigging crew, will happily pull a 36-hour shift to fix a collapsed truss, but only if I guarantee hot meals are delivered to his team every 6 hours. I also have to ensure his invoices are paid within 14 days, completely ignoring the standard net 90 payment terms Graham prefers to force upon our vendors. The industry magazines and trade publications like to attribute our massive multi-year contracts to the strong, dynamic brand presence of Beacon Row. That is a beautifully fabricated narrative. Heavyweight clients like Ironcrest Robotics, Calder Biosystems, and the Redshore Financial Forum do not sign 7-figure renewal checks because they like our corporate logo or Graham's charming smile. They stay because I engineer their absolute safety. I am the one who noticed the critical structural flaw in the Calder stage design 2 days before their global keynote, quietly bringing in a secondary engineering firm to reinforce the steel before a catastrophic collapse could occur. I am the one who rerouted 300 Red Shore executives through a sudden, blinding blizzard in Denver by commandeering a fleet of private charter buses when all commercial flights were grounded. I solve the crises in the deep shadows, ensuring they never breach the surface and become public scandals. To the clients, the events simply appear flawless. They assume Beacon Row is a well-oiled machine, completely unaware that I am the one manually turning the gears. Inside the office, the hierarchy on the organizational chart is practically meaningless. When a crisis hits, the line of desperate employees forms at my door, not the executive suite at the end of the hall. The travel department comes to me when a block of 500 hotel rooms evaporates into thin air due to a mysterious booking glitch. Vendor management seeks my immediate approval when a catering company suddenly doubles their quote 48 hours before a high-profile charity gala. The creative production team relies on me to tell them if their ambitious, floating, holographic projection is actually feasible within a historic venue's ceiling weight limits. Even finance operations, the people who technically report directly to Graham, quietly slip into my office to ask how to categorize emergency cash disbursements. They know Graham refuses to learn the accounting software and will only yell at them for disrupting his day. They come to me because I give them concrete answers, actionable solutions, and clear directions, not empty motivational speeches. This heavy reliance extends far beyond our own walls. The massive ecosystem of external partners, the actual entities that build the physical reality of our events, operates on a specialized currency of trust that I have personally minted over the last 9 years. Companies like Signal Forge Audiovisual and Atlas Venue Group do not bend their strict rules for Beacon Row. They bend them for Juliana Walker. The local printing houses, the union staging crews, the specialized event security firms, they all answer my calls on the first ring, whether it is 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. They do this because my reputation is spotless. I do not scream at them when a delivery truck breaks down on the highway. I do not make empty yet manipulative promises about future exposure to secure a predatory discount today. When the lead technician for Signal Forge called me last month, frantic because a custom LED wall had shattered in transit, I did not threaten to sue him. I simply asked, "How quickly can you source a replacement, and what do you need from my end to clear the loading dock for an emergency drop?" Because I handled it with cold, practical efficiency. He drove 4 hours through the night to personally install the backup screen. I give our partners clear directives. I treat them with professional respect, and I ensure they are never thrown under the bus to appease an angry client. I shield them, and in return, they move mountains for me. I did not acquire this level of absolute operational control through corporate espionage, ruthless maneuvering, or strategic backstabbing. I built it brick by painstaking brick, using thousands of microscopic details. It is the quiet power of remembering the severe peanut allergy of a major sponsor's spouse. It is the power of knowing exactly which union delegate to call to expedite a late freight delivery without triggering a strike. It is the power of keeping my word, every single time, in an industry built entirely on fragile smoke, strategically placed mirrors, and broken promises. But in my relentless, exhaustive pursuit of operational perfection, I made a critical, almost fatal error. It is the exact same tragic mistake countless highly competent women make in corporate environments everywhere across this country. I became entirely too good at the backstage labor. I focused so intently on keeping the foundation solid, checking every beam and tightening every bolt, that I allowed someone else to stand on the roof and loudly claim he built the house himself. I made the active, daily choice to be the invisible system that supported everything, foolishly believing that merit, hard work, and flawless execution would eventually translate into equity, respect, and a proper title. I allowed Graham to be the face on the magazine covers, the voice on the client calls, and the signature on the massive checks. Meanwhile, I became the nameless, faceless engine running red-hot in the basement, I made myself completely indispensable to the survival of the company, but in doing so, I made myself entirely invisible to the people who held the real power. I built a kingdom, handed the crown to a fool, and quietly went back to sweeping the floors. 3 weeks ago, before the folded piece of paper in my pocket even existed, I sat in a dimly lit, violently expensive corner booth at a steakhouse downtown. I was not there to placate an angry client or negotiate with a vendor. I was there across from Mara Sloan. Mara is the brilliant, ruthless architect behind Astor Loop Studio. While Graham spends his days chasing industry awards and practicing his speeches in the mirror, Mara spends hers methodically capturing market share. She does not wear tailored Italian suits or speak in hollow corporate buzzwords. She wears minimalist black, speaks in sharp, economical sentences, and looks at the competitive event landscape like a grandmaster analyzing a chessboard. I am not going to waste your time with a sales pitch. Juliana, Mara had said, swirling a glass of sparkling water, I want you at Astor Loop. I want you as my chief operating officer, and I am putting a substantial equity partnership directly on the table. Actual ownership, not a bonus structure contingent on impossible metrics, not a vague promise for the future. Ink on paper. I had stared at her, the ice slowly melting in my own glass. I was accustomed to aggressive headhunters circling me, tossing out nominal salary bumps or flashy vanity titles to lure me away to other sinking ships. But this was entirely different. This was a seat at the adult table. This was power. Why me? I had asked, playing the defensive line I had been conditioned to hold for nearly a decade. Beacon Row and Astor Loop play in the exact same sandbox, but we have completely different methodologies. Mara had laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any real humor. Do not insult my intelligence, and please stop insulting your own. The entire industry knows the absolute truth. They know Beacon Row retains its heavy portfolio not because Graham Pike is a visionary leader, but because Juliana Walker is the person who actually executes the vision. He is a charismatic frontman for a band where you are playing every single instrument. I do not want his brand. I do not want his flashy client list. I want the engine. I want you. She had slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood table. It contained the formal term sheet. The numbers were staggering, but the equity stake was what made my pulse thrum heavily in my ears. Yet, I did not sign it. I did not even open the envelope that night. I took it home, placed it securely in my desk drawer, and went to work the very next morning at Beacon Row. I was infected with a terminal, pathetic case of misplaced loyalty. I had spent 9 years pouring my blood and my sanity into Graham's foundation. Walking away felt like abandoning a house I had built with my bare hands simply because the landlord was a fool. I told Mara I needed time to consider her offer. Deep down, I was still waiting for Beacon Row to finally recognize my value. I was waiting for my immense loyalty to be reciprocated. Instead, the universe began handing me a magnifying glass. Once the seed of Mara's offer was planted in my mind, my entire perspective shifted. I stopped looking at Beacon Row as a dedicated, overworked employee and started looking at it like a forensic auditor. Suddenly, the severe cracks in the foundation were glaringly obvious. It started with the vendor invoices. For years, I had maintained a strict 30-day payment cycle with our core partners. It was the absolute bedrock of my operational leverage. But 2 weeks ago, the accounting department quietly changed the system. Payments were suddenly pushed to 45 days, then mysteriously delayed to 60 days. When I marched down to finance to flag the issue, I was met with vague, rehearsed excuses about cash flow optimization and quarterly realignment. Then came the bizarre, illogical budget restrictions. I submitted a standard request to upgrade the on-site communication radios for a massive medical summit, a negligible expense in a multi-million-dollar production budget. It was denied immediately by Graham himself. Yet, in that exact same week, he eagerly approved a massive lease for a secondary office space in a luxury high-rise building across town. We did not need the space, nor did we have the staff to fill it. He signed the lease simply because a rival chief executive had an office on the penthouse floor of the same building. The final, undeniable red flag materialized late one Thursday evening. I was walking past the executive suite well after standard business hours and heard Graham's voice bleeding through the heavy oak door. He was not using his booming, charismatic stage voice. He sounded cornered, frantic, and unusually small. He was arguing intensely about a revolving credit facility, covenant breaches, and immediate liquidity. He was speaking to a corporate banking underwriter. The puzzle pieces were scattered all over the floor, but it took Noah Baines to finally snap them together. Noah is a senior finance manager. He is a quiet, meticulously cautious man who rarely speaks above a whisper and treats his accounting spreadsheets like holy texts. 2 days before my catastrophic performance review, I found him standing in the desolate break room, staring blankly at the coffee machine. He looked as though he had not slept in a month. I asked him a simple, operational question about a delayed wire transfer to a prominent lighting company in Atlanta. Noah looked over his shoulder, ensuring the hallway was completely empty before he answered. The wire is delayed because there is absolutely nothing to wire. Juliana, he said, his voice tight with pure anxiety. The well is dry. We are completely maxed out on the credit line. I frowned, rapidly running the mental math of our recent accounts receivable. That is impossible. We just closed 3 massive contracts in the last quarter alone. Those contracts are financially useless, Noah countered bitterly. Graham underbid all of them just to secure the press releases and the industry buzz. The profit margins are practically non-existent, and that is not even the worst of it. Do you know how much capital he incinerated trying to launch that boutique music festival division last year? We took a massive, unmitigated loss. The bank is breathing down his neck right now. They are demanding a brutal, immediate reduction in overhead before the end of the month, or they are freezing the operational accounts entirely. He gave me a long, significant look, his eyes darting nervously toward the direction of the executive suite. He is looking for a sacrificial lamb, Juliana. He needs someone who costs a lot of money, but whose absence will not immediately trigger a panic with the board of directors or the press. I thanked Noah quietly and walked back to my desk, my stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. It was a masterclass in corporate survival at the complete expense of human decency. Graham was backed into a lethal financial corner entirely of his own making. He needed to slash massive amounts of payroll immediately to appease his lenders, but he could not fire a visible, titled executive without signaling to the market that Beacon Row was in severe distress. He could not touch the sales team, because they were the ones actively bringing in the deposits keeping us afloat. He needed a target who drew a high salary but operated entirely in the shadows. He needed me, but firing me outright was too dangerous. He knew, even if his ego would never allow him to admit it aloud, that the operational infrastructure would collapse overnight if I was simply terminated. So, he engineered a psychological trap designed with absolute, malicious precision. When the single sheet of paper detailing my salary reduction sat on his desk this morning, I understood instantly. By cutting my pay in half, he was forcing my hand into a corner. Option 1, I swallow my pride, accept the crushing humiliation, and stay. If I chose this, Graham instantly solves his massive cash flow problem while retaining the exact same flawless operational execution. He gets to keep his absolute best workhorse for half the price, us. Option 2. I refuse the insult and resign. If I walk away, I save him the trouble of paying a hefty severance package or justifying a termination to the Human Resources Department. More importantly, my departure gives him the perfect, impenetrable narrative. When the vendors inevitably revolt, when the events begin to fail miserably, and when the clients start asking angry questions, he will simply shake his head and play the tragic victim. He will tell everyone that Juliana Walker could not handle the pressure of the new market restructuring. He will say I lacked the necessary commitment to weather the storm. He will frame my resignation as a selfish betrayal, using my absence as a convenient, permanent shield to hide his own catastrophic financial incompetence. He thought he had me completely cornered. He thought he was playing a complex game of strategy while I was completely blind to the board. As I sat in the suffocating heat of my car in the parking lot, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The lingering sting of the salary cut vanished entirely. It was replaced by a profound, terrifying calm. The folded paper in my pocket was not a punishment for poor performance. It was a desperate, flailing move from a man drowning in his own hubris. For 9 long years, I had allowed this company to use my relentless work ethic to build an illusion. I had been the invisible skeleton supporting a rotting body. I had waited patiently for a narcissistic leader to suddenly develop integrity. When the paper slid across the desk, it was not a surprise. It was the final, undeniable signal that I had stayed entirely too long in a place that only knew how to use me. Graham Pike wanted to see what happened if he snapped the spine of his own company. He wanted to force me into a chaotic resignation. I was going to give him one, but I was not going to give him the messy, emotional, unprofessional exit he so desperately needed for his narrative. I tapped the reply button on Mara Sloane's email. I did not draft a long, poetic explanation about my worth. I typed a single, decisive sentence of acceptance, hit send, and finally started the engine of my car. I drove straight to a quiet coffee shop on the edge of the business district. I did not go back to the office immediately, sitting at a small wooden table. I opened my laptop and drafted a new email to Mara Sloane. I did not hedge. I did not negotiate further. I accepted the position of Chief Operating Officer at Astor Loop Studio, but I laid out my absolute baseline conditions in stark, undeniable terms. I required full, uncontested operational authority over the production teams. I required the equity partnership to be legally vested upon signing. And most importantly, I explicitly stated that I would never again function as the emotional shock absorber or the silent fixer for another executive's fragile ego. Mara replied within 15 minutes. Her response was a single word: agreed. At 3 o'clock that same afternoon, I walked back into the Beacon Row Live headquarters. I sat at my desk, opened a blank corporate letterhead document, and typed my formal resignation. I kept it ruthlessly brief. It contained no sprawling paragraphs about my 9 years of dedicated service. It contained no passive-aggressive remarks about my newly halved salary. It was a sterile, legally perfect document stating that I was providing my standard 2 weeks of notice, as stipulated in my original employment contract. I printed 2 copies, signed them in blue ink, and handed one directly to the head of Human Resources. I left the second copy squarely in the center of Graham Pike's empty mahogany desk. When Graham finally read it, he did not call me into his office to yell. He did not beg me to stay. He chose the path of petty, performative indifference. He spent the next 48 hours strolling through the bullpen, intentionally raising his voice just enough so I could hear him from my office. He told the creative directors and the sales team that I had been inflating my own role for entirely too long. He casually mentioned over by the coffee machines that Beacon Row was a dynamic, modern enterprise, and that our continued success did not depend on any single individual. He was practically vibrating with a false sense of victory, convinced that my quiet exit proved I was exactly the weak, easily replaceable subordinate he always believed me to be. He was so focused on winning the optics of the breakup that he completely failed to notice what I spent my final 2 weeks actually doing. Most people, when pushed to the absolute brink of professional humiliation, leave a trail of scorched earth behind them. They delete files, they hoard crucial contacts, they let critical deadlines slip through the cracks just to watch the fire burn. I did the exact opposite. I spent 14 days executing a handover process so thorough, so devastatingly professional, that it felt like laying out the surgical instruments for my own autopsy. I built massive, color-coded spreadsheets detailing every single upcoming event timeline for the next 6 months. I documented the exact status of every vendor contract, flagging potential logistical risks and highlighting key operational milestones. I created exhaustive standard operating procedure manuals for things I used to do purely from memory. But as I typed out these meticulous guides, a cold, satisfying realization settled over me. You can document a timeline. You cannot document trust. I could write down the primary phone number for the regional manager of the largest staging warehouse in the Midwest. But I could not write down the fact that he would only unlock the loading bay doors at 1 in the morning because he knew my voice, knew I would not waste his time, and knew I would personally guarantee his overtime pay. I could list the emergency contact for the vice president of Halcyon Health Devices, but I could not transfer the deep, psychological relief she felt when I walked into a chaotic ballroom and told her I had everything under control. Graham believed my value was tied to the tasks I completed. He never understood that my actual value was the unshakable faith I had cultivated with the people who performed the labor. Graham, in his infinite strategic wisdom, decided that my job was simple enough to be divided among 3 different mid-level managers. For my final 10 days, these 3 individuals orbited my desk like terrified satellites. They had been handed pieces of my portfolio but lacked the foundational context to understand any of it. Juliana, the newly appointed logistics lead, would whisper, hovering nervously by my door. Atlas Venue Group just rejected our revised rigging plot for the summit next month. The contract says we have until Friday. What do I tell them? I would look up from my meticulously organized screen. You tell them the contract is standard, but the fire marshal in that specific county requires a 10-day preliminary review for suspended weights exceeding 5,000 pounds. I usually submit a shadow draft directly to the inspector before the venue even sees it. The manager would stare at me, completely lost. How do I do that? You call the inspector, I would reply calmly, handing over another printed document, but he does not answer emails. You have to call his direct line between 7 and 8 in the morning. This happened dozens of times a day. The 3 managers were constantly running back to my desk, holding my own handover documents like useless maps in a foreign country. Every panicked question they asked only illuminated the massive, terrifying gap between my job description on paper and the crushing reality of what I actually carried. A few of the senior coordinators, the ones who had been in the trenches with me for years, could smell the ozone in the air. They knew a catastrophic storm was brewing just over the horizon. During my final week, 2 of them cornered me in the break room. They looked exhausted and deeply afraid. They asked if they should start polishing their resumes. I did not use the moment to recruit them to Astorloop. I was bound by my strict exit terms, and I refused to play dirty when playing clean is so much more lethal. Do not panic, I told them softly, making sure the hallway was clear. But you need to protect yourselves immediately. Keep your project files impeccably clean. Document every single directive Graham gives you in writing. If he gives you a verbal order that contradicts a vendor agreement or a budget limitation, you follow up with an email asking for written confirmation. Do not let your names become the shield he uses to deflect his own mistakes. The shield always takes the damage. They nodded slowly, the gravity of my warning settling into their shoulders. When Friday finally arrived, my departure was completely unremarkable. There was no farewell cake in the conference room. There were no grand speeches or forced applause. At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, I shut down my computer for the final time. I wiped the hard drive of my personal passwords and left the corporate device precisely in the center of the desk, perfectly aligned with the edges of the docking station. I picked up a single, small cardboard box containing my framed degree, a coffee mug, and a pair of emergency flat shoes I kept under my desk. I did not take a single piece of proprietary company data. I did not download a master client list to a hidden flash drive. I did not forward internal emails to my personal account. I walked down the long corridor, past the glass-walled offices, and pushed through the heavy lobby doors. The warm evening air hit my face, smelling intensely of hot asphalt and freedom. I walked to my car and placed the small box on the passenger seat. I left Beacon Row Live entirely empty-handed, taking absolutely nothing that legally belonged to them. I only took the one asset Graham Pike could never cut, claim, or control. I took my reputation, and without it, his company was nothing more than an empty, expensive shell waiting to collapse under its own weight. I began my first week at Astorloop Studio on a brisk Monday morning. The environment was a stark contrast to my previous workplace. The office was significantly smaller and completely devoid of the suffocating, performative luxury that Graham Pike demanded. There were no imported leather couches, no sprawling mahogany conference tables, and absolutely no vanity public relations awards mounted on the walls. It was a lean, heavily functional space buzzing with a quiet, relentless energy. At Astor Loop, every single operational decision was made based on raw competence and factual data, completely ignoring the artificial weight of flashy corporate titles. Mara Sloan respected execution, not ego. Within my first 48 hours, I was fully integrated into their supply chain. My directives were instantly implemented, and I finally understood what it felt like to work inside a machine where every gear was actually designed to turn. Meanwhile, across the city, Beacon Row Live did not collapse in a spectacular fiery explosion. Large corporate entities rarely do. Instead, the decay began with tiny microscopic fractures in the operational foundation, proving that the entire structure was fundamentally compromised long before I ever walked out the door. The first critical crack appeared on Tuesday afternoon. The primary project sponsor for Halcyon Health Devices called the main reception desk, urgently needing to discuss a last-minute alteration to the exhibition floor plan for their massive quarterly medical conference. The receptionist, a young woman who had only been with the company for 2 months, stared at her glowing phone console in sheer panic. She had absolutely no idea who to route the call to. For years, her standard operating procedure for any high-level, complex logistical issue was simply to transfer the line directly to my extension. After desperately bouncing the frustrated client between 3 different voicemails, the call finally landed on Graham's desk. Graham picked up the phone, projecting his usual booming, artificially deep stage voice. The sponsor immediately began referencing the intricate, millimeter-specific differences between version 3 and version 4 of the structural layout, asking if the load-bearing pillars in the main hall could accommodate the newly requested digital display walls. Graham was entirely lost. He had never looked at the venue blueprints. He did not know the dimensions of the hall, and he certainly did not know which iteration of the floor plan they were discussing. He attempted to pivot the conversation toward high-level branding strategies and synergistic attendee engagement, but the client grew immediately cold, demanding hard technical answers that Graham simply did not possess. By Wednesday morning, the fractures rapidly spread into the digital infrastructure. An event coordinator at a massive, notoriously strict convention center in Dallas sent an urgent email flagged with high importance. It contained an unyielding deadline to submit the supplemental liability insurance certificates and the heavily updated stage weight load diagrams for an upcoming tech summit. The venue required certified documentation proving our rigging design could safely hold exactly 12,000 pounds of specialized lighting equipment. That email sat completely unopened in a shared departmental inbox for over 36 hours. Graham had divided my portfolio among 3 mid-level managers, and each of them quietly assumed one of the others was handling the Dallas account. In the past, that email would have bypassed the general inbox, landed directly on my screen, and I would have routed the verified insurance certificates to the venue within 15 minutes. Now, the deadline silently expired, triggering an automatic stop work order on the Dallas loading dock that would soon cost the agency tens of thousands of dollars in delay penalties. The internal friction quickly escalated from misted digital communications to direct hostile confrontations with our external partners. Signal Forge Audio Visual, one of our most vital and historically flexible technical vendors, called the newly appointed logistics manager. They demanded final, written confirmation on the rigging schedule for an upcoming financial expo. The new manager cheerfully sent over the master document she had found filed away on the shared server. 10 minutes later, the lead technician called back, his tone entirely devoid of its usual patience. "This schedule is completely wrong," the technician barked over the phone, his voice carrying through the thin glass walls of the office. "I spoke with Juliana last Thursday afternoon. We agreed verbally to push the truss assembly back by 4 hours so the carpeting crew could finish the main center aisle, and we agreed to swap the standard monitors for the ultra-wide screens on the main stage to avoid a massive glare issue." The new manager scrambled. her hands shaking as she clicked frantically through her meticulously color-coded spreadsheets. "I am sorry. I do not have any record of those changes anywhere in these files. We have to stick to the printed schedule." The senior account manager assigned to the financial expo attempted to intervene and extinguish the fire. He joined a conference call with the client later that afternoon, offering a dizzying array of evasive circular answers about internal realignments, transitional phases, and cross-departmental synergies. He promised the client repeatedly that the entire Beacon Row team was fully dedicated to their success, but the client was not foolish. Listening to the panicked, disjointed answers and the glaring lack of specific details, the brutal reality finally dawned on them. They realized, for the very first time, that the flawless, unified machine they thought they were hiring did not actually exist. The entire Beacon Row team they had trusted with their multi-million-dollar budget had always just been one woman sitting quietly in the background, keeping the wheels attached to the axle. Sensing the rapidly growing unrest and the souring mood of his biggest accounts, Graham decided he needed to step in and take absolute, visible control of the sinking ship. He began aggressively inserting himself into daily production calls, a space he had historically avoided at all costs, but his forceful presence only accelerated the disaster. He spoke constantly in broad, sweeping strokes. He demanded that the teams leverage their dynamic paradigms and focus on the holistic client journey. He tossed around an endless stream of hollow corporate buzzwords, but the moment a vendor asked him a direct, practical question about generator fuel capacity, union labor meal penalty rules, or local fire marshal permit regulations, he froze completely. He repeatedly exposed the embarrassing fact that he only understood the thin layer of fresh paint on the outside of the building, completely ignorant of the structural beams holding it up. The external vendors, the absolute lifeblood of the high-stakes event industry, were the first to formally change their posture. They remained strictly polite and professional, but the invisible, invaluable grace period vanished overnight. The printing houses refused to process any rush orders without a signed purchase order and a 50% cash deposit up front. The staging companies completely stopped holding premium equipment in reserve based on a quick phone call and a handshake. The security firms rigidly enforced their 72-hour cancellation penalty clauses without exception. They no longer bent over backward to solve our problems. They no longer ignored late invoice payments. And they certainly no longer worked through the night simply because they were asked nicely. The phrase, "because Juliana said so," had been the single strongest currency Beacon Row possessed, and that account was now completely bankrupt. I did not witness this chaotic unraveling firsthand. I heard about it in quiet, deliberate fragments throughout the week. My phone buzzed constantly with social calls and text messages from former colleagues, stressed account managers, and trusted vendor partners. They initially called to politely check in on my new role, but they inevitably spilled the chaotic details of the unfolding disaster across town. They described the mounting panic, the severely missed deadlines, and Graham's increasingly erratic, defensive behavior. I sat at my clean, organized desk at Astor Loop Studio, listening to a venue manager from Chicago describe how a new Beacon Row coordinator had accidentally booked the heavy machinery delivery at the exact same time as the VIP catering load-in, causing a massive logistical bottleneck that shut down an entire city block for 3 hours. I did not laugh at the story. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy, nor did I celebrate the misery of the people I had left behind. Instead, a profound, quiet clarity washed over me. I looked at my new computer monitor, watching my highly capable team at Astor Loop flawlessly execute a complex logistical plan. The absolute truth was finally laid bare for the entire industry to see. Beacon Row Live did not suddenly lose its capability in a single week. It did not experience a sudden, tragic stroke of bad luck or market turbulence. The company had always been entirely empty inside. The only thing they actually lost was the one woman who had spent 9 grueling years desperately trying to hide Graham Pike's profound incompetence from the rest of the world. And now, the curtain had been ripped down, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. It took exactly 22 days for the first major pillar of Beacon Row Live to formally collapse. I did not push it. I did not even lean against it. I simply stood across the city and watched as the foundation gave way entirely on its own. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. I looked down at my glowing screen and saw the name of the Vice President of Marketing for Halcyon Health Devices. For a brief second, I let the phone ring, carefully running through my legal obligations. I was bound by a standard non-solicitation clause from my previous employment. I knew the rules intimately. I could not poach. I could not lure. And I absolutely could not initiate contact to draw business away from Graham. But the law is very clear about free market agency. If a client finds themselves standing in a burning building, you are not legally prohibited from opening the door when they come knocking on yours. I answered the call on the fourth ring. "Juliana," the vice president said, her voice tight with a mixture of exhaustion and profound irritation. "I am going to ask you a very direct question, and I need a very direct answer. Is Astor Loop Studio currently accepting new pitches for the upcoming fiscal year?" I kept my voice perfectly measured. "We are expanding our portfolio for the next year." "Yes. But to be entirely transparent, I cannot legally solicit your business or initiate any transition discussions." "You are not soliciting anything," she replied sharply. "I am actively looking for a new agency. Beacon Row just bungled our third-quarter vendor contract so badly that my legal team had to step in and mediate. Graham got on a call yesterday and called me by the wrong name twice. I am done. I want to send you our request for proposal by the end of the day. I will look for it in my inbox," I said softly. When Mara and I built the pitch for Halcyon, we did not waste a single second bad-mouthing Beacon Row. Trashing your competitor is a weak strategy used by people who have nothing substantial to offer. Instead, we built a presentation rooted in the one thing Graham could never provide. We offered absolute, unvarnished operational truth. We did not bring glossy brochures or mood boards filled with abstract concepts. We brought a meticulously detailed logistical timeline. We presented a fully transparent budget where every single vendor markup was clearly capped at 15%, eliminating the hidden fees Graham used to pad his margins. Most importantly, we included a comprehensive risk assessment document. We looked the client in the eye and called the potential disasters by their actual names. We outlined exactly what would happen if a venue lost power, if a union strike occurred during load-in, or if a keynote speaker canceled at the last minute. And we provided the exact contingency plans for each scenario. We won the Halcyon contract within 48 hours. Their departure from Beacon Row did not create a massive, noisy public spectacle. Halcyon simply declined to renew their retainer, quietly paid their final invoices, and walked away. But in the tight-knit ecosystem of corporate events, silence is often much louder than a shout. Other massive accounts started paying closer attention. They began noticing the missed deadlines, the sudden turnover in their account management teams, and the distinct lack of the invisible friction-proofing they had grown accustomed to. They started asking themselves why everything used to feel so effortless, and why every single event now felt like a chaotic emergency. Then came the surprise that genuinely made me smile. A man named Spencer quit his job at Beacon Row. Spencer was Graham's golden boy, the supposed spearhead of the sales department. Graham used to parade him around the office, loudly praising him for closing massive deals and bringing in millions of dollars in fresh revenue. But the dark secret of Beacon Row was that Spencer was nothing more than a charismatic liar. He would sit in a room with a prospective client and promise them the moon. He would guarantee them a custom-built floating stage over a lake for $50,000. Or promise a 3-day turnaround on complex municipal permits that legally took 3 weeks to process. For years, I was the one who had to catch those impossible promises before they hit the ground. I would work back channels, call in massive favors, negotiate brutally with vendors, and pull off minor miracles just to make Spencer's lies look like the truth. Without me there to silently fix his impossible deliverables, Spencer was suddenly exposed. When he promised a client a logistical impossibility, the new operations team simply looked at him and said they could not do it. His clients grew furious. His deals fell apart, his commissions evaporated, and he panicked. He resigned on a Friday, proving once and for all that a brilliant salesman is absolutely useless without a competent operator to build what he sells. As Astor Loop absorbed the incoming wave of disillusioned clients, our revenue grew rapidly. Mara and I were suddenly in a position to scale the company, but I was fiercely protective of the environment we were building. I flatly refused to hire recklessly just to fill desks. We interviewed dozens of candidates, but I only extended offers to people who possessed a deep, fundamental respect for the grueling reality of operational work. I hired people who understood that a successful event is not built on a stage, but on a loading dock at 3 a.m. Back at his hollowed-out agency, Graham began to completely unravel. As his profit margins plummeted and his best clients quietly exited through the back door, his panic morphed into aggressive legal threats. He had his lawyers draft aggressive, blustering letters accusing me of tortious interference, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate sabotage. He threatened to enforce a draconian non-compete clause that my own legal counsel had already proven was entirely unenforceable in our jurisdiction. He wanted to drag me into a messy public fight because it was the only way he could justify his own failure. He wanted to tell his board of directors that I had stolen his empire, rather than admit he had carelessly thrown it away. I did not respond to a single one of his angry emails. I forwarded all of his threats directly to our corporate attorney, who systematically dismantled them with cold, hard documentation. I had kept my hands perfectly clean. Every client who transitioned to Astor Loop had signed a sworn affidavit stating they had initiated the contact due to a severe decline in service quality at Beacon Row. Graham had absolutely no legal ground to stand on, and with every hollow threat he issued, he only highlighted his own desperate impotence. While Graham wasted his dwindling capital on legal fees for a fight he could never win, I focused entirely on building the exact culture he had always suppressed. When the first massive payment from the Halcyon contract cleared our bank account, Mara and I did not lease a penthouse office. We did not buy custom leather furniture or hire a vanity public relations firm. Instead, I called a company-wide meeting in our modest break room. I looked at the technical directors, the vendor coordinators, and the logistics managers who had been working tirelessly to absorb the new business. I handed out substantial, unexpected cash bonuses. I promoted our lead logistics coordinator to a directorial role, accompanied by a significant salary increase and a clear path to equity. I made sure that the people sweating in the shadows were finally pulled into the light. I paid them what they were actually worth. I gave them the authority they deserved, and I publicly credited them for the success of the agency. I was taking all the painful lessons Graham Pike had taught me about invisibility and turning them into a permanent foundation. I was proving that a company does not need a loud, charismatic figurehead to survive, but it will absolutely die without the people who know how to turn the gears. The email arrived in my inbox at exactly 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. It was forwarded by David, the regional director of our most reliable national lighting and staging vendor. David and I had worked together for nearly a decade, and he knew my communication style as well as he knew his own equipment inventory. The subject line of his forward was blank, but the message attached below it made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a direct communication from Graham Pike to David, sent late the previous evening. The lighting company had officially frozen Beacon Row's account due to severe payment delays, refusing to load out equipment for an upcoming tech summit. In a desperate bid to buy time, Graham had written a lengthy, patronizing email about temporary cash flow realignments, but the final paragraph was the one that stopped my breath. "Please bear with our team during this brief transitional phase," Graham had written. "Juliana Walker is still actively consulting with us on the back-end transition to ensure all of our premium vendor accounts remain perfectly stable and seamlessly managed. Your patience is appreciated while she finalizes this handover." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words a second time to ensure I was not hallucinating. I was not insulted. Insult is a minor, emotional reaction to a slight. What I felt was the sudden, sharp drop of genuine danger. Graham was not just telling a pathetic lie to save face. He was committing active corporate fraud. He was actively impersonating my professional influence to manipulate a vendor into extending credit to a company that was rapidly going bankrupt. He was using my reputation as collateral without my consent. If Beacon Row inevitably defaulted on those invoices, the vendors would have a paper trail suggesting I was involved in the deception. He was tying me to a sinking ship I had already abandoned. I stood up immediately, walked down the short hallway of the Astor Loop studio office, and stepped into Mara's workspace. I turned my laptop around and pushed it across her desk. Mara read the email once, her jaw tightening. Within 10 minutes, we had our corporate counsel, a razor-sharp attorney named Evelyn, sitting at the conference table. This crosses the line from petty corporate politics into severe legal liability, Evelyn said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. He is leveraging your established industry trust to secure unapproved credit extensions. We are shutting this down right now. By noon, Evelyn had drafted a terrifyingly precise cease and desist order. It was delivered directly to the legal department at Beacon Row Live, bypassing Graham entirely. The document demanded the immediate cessation of any unauthorized use of my name, my likeness, my professional history, or any implied ongoing association with their agency. It required a legally binding, signed acknowledgement from their board of directors within 24 hours, explicitly stating that I was no longer an employee, a consultant, or a shadow operator for their firm. I hit send on the final approval, feeling a grim satisfaction. I thought the cease and desist would be the most explosive event of the week. I was entirely wrong. The real detonation happened the very next afternoon. My personal cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name Noah Baines, Noah, the senior finance manager who had quietly warned me about the dry credit lines weeks ago, sounded completely out of breath. He asked if I could meet him at a small, anonymous diner located 3 towns over from the business district. He insisted on a place where absolutely no one from the industry would recognize us. When I slid into the vinyl booth an hour later, Noah looked as though he had aged 10 years. He was clutching a thick, unlabeled manila folder. He ordered a black coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped his fingers around the porcelain mug. "I resigned this morning," Noah said, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. I packed my desk before anyone else even arrived at the office. I am done. Juliana, I cannot be legally attached to what Graham is doing anymore. I leaned forward, the noise of the clattering diner fading into the background. What exactly is he doing? Noah? He slid the manila folder across the sticky table. He is drowning, and he is trying to pull everyone else under the water so he can stand on their shoulders. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of printed financial dashboards, internal memorandums, and email transcripts. They were not just messy accounting errors, they were the meticulously documented anatomy of a betrayal. Noah carefully explained the timeline. 6 weeks ago, long before my catastrophic performance review, Beacon Row's primary commercial lender had threatened to freeze the entire revolving credit facility. Graham had spent millions of dollars on vanity projects, luxury office spaces, and disastrous festival investments. The bank demanded an emergency audit. To secure a crucial extension on the loan, Graham had to prove 2 things: that the operational foundation of the company was highly profitable, and that he was taking immediate, aggressive steps to slash overhead costs. "Look at the presentation slides he gave the bank," Noah instructed, pointing a shaking finger at the top document. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was my data. Graham had taken my quarterly operational spreadsheets, my vendor efficiency metrics, my client retention rates, and my flawless event execution scores, and slapped his own name on the cover page. He sat in a room with a panel of severe loan officers and used the exact systems I had built from scratch to prove that his company was a safe investment. He used my unblemished track record to secure the financial lifeline. "He used your success to keep the doors open," Noah said grimly. But then the bank demanded the massive payroll cuts. He needed to show an immediate reduction in executive compensation before the next quarter began. "That is when he targeted you." I turned to the next page in the folder. It was a printed email from Graham to the external human resources consultant, dated 3 days before he slid that piece of paper across my desk and cut my salary in half. My name was at the very top of a hit list. But the context was what made my stomach physically turn. Graham had not just planned to slash my pay. He had carefully orchestrated a psychological trap, fully expecting me to walk away. And he had already written the script for my departure, the drafted memorandum, intended for the board of directors and key investors, outlined a completely fabricated narrative. It stated that as Beacon Row transitioned into a highly demanding, agile restructuring phase, Juliana Walker was demonstrating severe signs of burnout and an inability to adapt to modern corporate pressures. It suggested that my operational methods were outdated, and that my eventual departure would be the unfortunate result of my own professional limitations. He was never going to fire me outright, because that would require severance pay and invite a wrongful termination lawsuit. Instead, he planned to humiliate me, force me to resign, and then use my resignation as proof that I was weak. The pieces clicked together with a sickening metallic finality. He used the magnificent house I built to secure his mortgage. Then he set the house on fire and planned to tell the insurance company that I was the one playing with matches. He used the financial fruits of my labor to protect his own credit line, and then turned around and stole half my salary to balance his broken ledger. This was no longer a simple story about a capable woman leaving a toxic, unappreciative workplace. It had morphed into a dark, suffocating corporate thriller. I was looking at the documented evidence of a desperate, cornered man who was perfectly willing to twist reality, manipulate banks, and completely obliterate the reputation of the only person who had ever kept him standing. He did not just want me gone, he wanted me ruined, so his own failure could be neatly blamed on my supposed incompetence. I closed the manila folder, resting my hands flat against the cardboard cover. The initial shock evaporated, completely burned away by a cold, absolute fury. Graham Pike thought he had neatly tied up all his loose ends. He thought he had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of hollow corporate jargon and manipulated spreadsheets. He did not realize that I was now holding the shovel. I looked across the table at Noah. The terrified accountant was waiting for me to break down, to panic, or to call a lawyer in a hysterical fit. Instead, I carefully placed the folder into my leather bag and took a slow sip of my water. Graham had spent his entire career underestimating my intelligence, but his greatest mistake was underestimating my memory. I knew exactly where every single one of his financial skeletons was buried, because I was the one who had been forced to dig the graves. And now, armed with the exact coordinates, I was going to unearth every single one of them. The walls were rapidly closing in on Graham Pike. The commercial bank was circling. The essential vendor credit lines were practically frozen, and the quiet industry whispers had escalated into a deafening roar. Desperate for a massive influx of cash and a high-profile victory to convince the market that Beacon Row Live was still a premier agency, Graham decided to gamble absolutely everything on a single, monumental project. He aggressively pursued the comprehensive operational contract for the MedAccess Innovation Forum. MedAccess was not a standard, easily managed corporate retreat. It was a sprawling, notoriously complex medical technology convention. It required coordinating highly sensitive logistical webs, managing unforgiving schedules for world-renowned surgeons, navigating the delicate egos of top-tier pharmaceutical sponsors, and ensuring a flawless, premium on-site experience for over 5,000 demanding attendees. To secure the massive contract, Graham underbid the project by hundreds of thousands of dollars. He slashed the projected operational budget to the bone, entirely convinced he could simply duplicate the historical formulas I had meticulously built for previous medical summits. He genuinely believed the static formula itself was the magic, completely failing to understand that the formula only survived reality because I had been the one constantly calibrating it in real time. Without my hands on the wheel, the internal infrastructure at Beacon Row began to violently tear itself apart under the crushing weight of the MedAccess demands. The chaos was not theatrical. It was terrifyingly mundane and catastrophic. The newly appointed account managers immediately mixed up the complex sponsorship tier deliverables, accidentally promising premium main-stage branding to a mid-level local vendor, while entirely ignoring the primary international financial backer. The overwhelmed hotel coordinator misaligned the master room blocks, accidentally releasing over 300 premium suites back to the general public precisely when the most important VIP delegates were scheduled to arrive. Crucial venue load-in paperwork was sent to the wrong municipal department, and the incredibly detailed, minute-by-minute service checklists required for the high-net-worth attendees were completely abandoned because no one on the remaining staff knew how to interpret the tracking codes I had developed. My personal phone began to ring late at night. The calls were not from angry executives. They were from the terrified junior coordinators and mid-level managers still trapped inside the Beacon Row office. They did not call to gossip or complain. They called because they were staring directly at an approaching disaster and lacked the institutional authority to stop it. They were desperate, terrified that their own professional reputations would be permanently destroyed by the impending Medaxis catastrophe. They have the massive catering load-in scheduled at the exact same time as the heavy audiovisual rigging, a former colleague whispered frantically to me on a Tuesday evening, her voice shaking. The venue dockmaster is going to lock us out. Juliana, Graham told me to just make it work. I do not know how to make it work. I listened to their panic, my heart genuinely aching for the talented people caught in the crossfire, but I refused to step in. I offered a few calm words of general advice, strictly reminding them to document every single impossible directive they were given in writing. But I did not jump into the burning building to extinguish Graham's fires. I had to let the rotting structure fall. Instead of looking backward, I channeled every ounce of my energy, focus, and operational fury into Astor Loop Studio. While Beacon Row crumbled, Mara and I took on a massive, highly visible regional financial summit spanning 3 major cities. We executed the entire multi-city tour with surgical precision. We delivered the complex series under budget, ahead of schedule, and without a single logistical friction point. Our vendors were paid in exactly 14 days. The clients were ecstatic. The stark contrast between our flawless execution and the loudly rumored chaos at Beacon Row became impossible for the industry to ignore. A prominent local business journal even published a glowing feature on Astor Loop, specifically highlighting our transparent, radically honest approach to event logistics and our rapid capture of the regional market share. As our operational capacity expanded, I finally began to strategically recruit. I carefully interviewed a select few of my former colleagues who had officially resigned from Beacon Row. I subjected every single candidate to a rigorous review of their exit contracts to ensure we were not violating any legally binding non-solicitation clauses. When I formally offered them a position at Astor Loop, I laid down the absolute law on their very first day. You are here because you are exceptional at your jobs. I told a group of 3 new hires sitting in our bright, functional conference room, but we operate differently here. You do not bring a single piece of proprietary data from your former employer. You do not bring old client lists. You do not bring their vendor pricing sheets. We do not play dirty, and we do not need their scraps to win. You bring your expertise, your work ethic, and your absolute honesty. That is the only currency we accept. Graham, backed firmly into a corner with his flagship event falling apart and his former employees fleeing to the agency rapidly eating his market share, finally lashed out with the only weapon he had left. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, a licensed process server walked into the Astor Loop lobby and handed me a massive stack of legal documents. Graham was suing me, Mara, and Astor Loop Studio for millions of dollars. The lawsuit was a sprawling, aggressive piece of legal fiction. He formally accused me of tortious interference, malicious sabotage of his corporate relationships, and the intentional, coordinated poaching of his staff and his clients. He filed the massive lawsuit knowing full well he had very little concrete evidence. His strategy was entirely transparent. He was hoping the sheer financial weight and public spectacle of a massive legal battle would drain our resources, terrify our new clients, and force us to slow down our rapid expansion. When I placed the thick binder of legal complaints onto Mara's desk, I did not feel a single drop of panic. I did not tremble. and I did not raise my voice. I felt an electrifying surge of cold, focused anticipation. Mara looked up from the front page, her eyes narrowing sharply. He is trying to bury us in legal fees. He wants to force a quick, quiet settlement so he can tell his board he won. He is not going to get a settlement, I replied smoothly, tapping the heavy binder with my index finger. Give this directly to Evelyn. Tell her we are going to fight every single line of this in open court. Graham had spent his entire career successfully hiding his incompetence behind closed doors, manipulating narratives, and forcing people like me to quietly clean up his disasters. He genuinely believed this aggressive lawsuit would terrify me and force me back into a submissive, defensive posture. He completely forgot how the legal system actually works. By formally initiating a lawsuit, he had inadvertently unlocked the exact mechanism that would permanently destroy him. A lawsuit meant moving directly into the discovery phase. It meant mandatory legal subpoenas. It meant that every single internal communication, every manipulated financial dashboard, every delayed vendor invoice, and every panicked email he had sent over the last 12 months would be forcibly dragged out into the brutal, unforgiving light of day. He thought he was writing the final, humiliating chapter of my career, but he had just legally mandated the publication of his own complete failure. The ultimate truth was finally going to be told, and this time, the time-stamped data would do all the talking. Evelyn's office was a fortress of pristine white walls and towering stacks of cardboard banker's boxes. The discovery phase of Graham's lawsuit had officially commenced, and just as I had predicted, the legal mandate to produce internal communications was acting as a wrecking ball against his fragile, fabricated narrative. I sat across from Evelyn on a rainy Tuesday morning, watching her meticulously organize a fresh stack of printed emails. She did not look like a defense attorney fighting a multi-million-dollar corporate sabotage case. She looked like an apex predator examining a particularly satisfying catch. He genuinely thought he could bury these documents in the recent server migration, Evelyn said, her voice laced with sharp amusement as she slid a highlighted piece of paper across the desk. He completely forgot that metadata is entirely permanent. I picked up the paper. It was a direct communication from Graham to his chief financial officer, dated exactly 4 days before my infamous performance review. The language was cold, transactional, and legally devastating. Graham had explicitly written that they needed to, quote, reset compensation before the lender call, end quote. The following paragraph detailed his precise strategy to, quote, force a decision, end quote, from me before the new financial quarter officially began. There was absolutely no mention of my actual job performance. There was no discussion of operational inefficiencies or changing market dynamics. It was a premeditated financial ambush designed solely to appease his bankers. Evelyn handed me a second, thicker folder. This one contained a chronological audit log directly from the Human Resources Department. It gets significantly worse for him, she noted, tapping the top page with her pen. Look closely at the timestamps on these performance review notes. I scanned the digital log. The Human Resources Director had entered 3 separate, highly critical notes regarding my supposed lack of leadership and poor communication skills. But the system timestamps showed these entries were created at 9 o'clock at night, a full 48 hours after I had already handed in my formal resignation. Graham had panicked, realizing I was actually walking away without an emotional fight. He had desperately ordered his staff to retroactively fabricate a negative performance history to legally justify the massive salary cut he had already executed. He was building a fake crime scene after the body was already gone. It is a completely manufactured paper trail, Evelyn stated flatly, closing the folder. And we have the internal witness to prove it. Noah Baines had officially retained his own legal counsel and formally agreed to provide a sworn deposition for our side. His forthcoming testimony was the final nail in the coffin. Noah was prepared to state on the legal record that Beacon Row leadership explicitly utilized aggressive salary reductions of senior operational staff as a deceptive, short-term mechanism to artificially inflate their cash flow metrics for the commercial lenders. He would testify that the root cause of the company's financial distress was entirely tied to Graham's extravagant, unauthorized vanity expenditures, completely exonerating my management of the production budgets. To completely shatter the tortious interference claim, Evelyn had also secured ironclad written affidavits from two of our largest newly acquired accounts, including the vice president of Halcyon Health Devices. Both corporate executives swore under penalty of perjury that their transition to Astor Loop Studio was in no way prompted by solicitation or coercion on my part. Their sworn statements explicitly cited Beacon Rowe's sudden, catastrophic inability to fulfill basic contractual obligations as the sole reason for their departure. The legal trap Graham thought he was setting for me had turned into a concrete bunker, and he had locked himself inside with the key on the outside. While Graham's legal foundation rapidly disintegrated in the absolute privacy of Evelyn's office, his operational reality was publicly imploding on the convention floor of the MedAxis Innovation Forum. The medical technology convention had finally arrived, and the reports leaking out from the venue were apocalyptic. Because Graham had gutted the operational budget and alienated his best vendors, the intricate production timeline had instantly fractured. The structural rigging crews, furious over unpaid invoices from previous months, rigidly refused to work a single minute of uncompensated overtime. As a result, the massive overhead lighting trusses were still sitting on the bare concrete floor just 4 hours before the main exhibition doors were scheduled to open. Major pharmaceutical sponsors, massive companies that had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for premium branding placements, arrived to find their custom-built booths shoved into poorly lit, low-traffic corners. The newly hired floor managers had completely misinterpreted the zoning blueprints and were desperately trying to shift heavy structures at the last possible minute. The most damning failures, however, occurred in the highly sensitive VIP sectors. High net worth investors, keynote speakers, and world-renowned surgeons were left wandering the massive convention halls without guides. They complained loudly to anyone who would listen that the on-site hospitality teams had absolutely no idea how to execute the complex, personalized service briefs they required. Graham had assumed he could just copy and paste my old operational checklists, completely failing to realize that a checklist is utterly useless if the staff reading it lacks the contextual experience to execute the steps. The pressure was building to an intolerable degree, and the inevitable collision finally occurred on a Thursday evening at a prestigious industry networking gala downtown. I attended the event with Mara, both of us representing the rapidly expanding Astor Loop Studio. The high-ceilinged ballroom was packed with event professionals, venue directors, and heavy-hitting corporate clients. The ambient noise was a loud, continuous roar of clinking cocktail glasses and strategic business conversations. I was standing near the center of the room, calmly discussing a future partnership with a regional catering director, when the atmosphere around me suddenly shifted. The casual chatter in my immediate vicinity dropped to a dead, highly uncomfortable silence. I turned around. Graham Pike was standing less than 3 feet away from me. He looked absolutely atrocious. His usually immaculate, custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and the charming, camera-ready smile he normally wore like polished armor was completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room with a frantic, cornered energy. He had obviously been drinking heavily, but the alcohol had not dulled his panic. It had only stripped away his thin veneer of professional restraint. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, completely ignoring the catering director who quickly backed away to avoid the blast radius. Graham leaned in, his voice pitched low, carrying a venomous, trembling rage that was far more dangerous than a loud shout. "Are you happy now, Juliana?" he hissed, the sharp smell of expensive scotch heavy on his breath. "Are you enjoying the show? You tore my entire agency apart from the inside out. You poisoned the vendors against me. You stole my best clients. You destroyed absolutely everything I built just because you were too selfish to stay and do your job." The surrounding guests were entirely silent, their eyes locked onto us, holding their collective breath. They fully expected a dramatic screaming match. They expected me to aggressively defend myself, to call him a liar, or to flee the room in sheer embarrassment. I did not take a single step backward, I did not break eye contact. I let his desperate, pathetic accusations hang in the heavy air for a long, agonizing moment. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no urge to list his corporate crimes or mention the devastating legal documents currently sitting in my attorney's office. I was simply looking at a drowning man violently demanding that the water apologize for his lack of a boat. "I did not break your company, Graham," I said. My voice was cold, perfectly steady, and loud enough for every single person standing in our circle to hear with absolute clarity. "I just stopped carrying it." Graham physically recoiled. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The absolute, undeniable truth of my statement hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He looked frantically around the circle of onlookers, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face, but he found absolutely nothing but quiet, judging stares. The industry knew the truth. They knew exactly who did the grueling work in the shadows, and they knew exactly who stood on the stage to take the credit. He spun around and practically ran toward the exit, his posture completely broken and defeated. I watched him disappear through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, turning my attention calmly back to the catering director as if nothing had happened. The severe tension in the room slowly dissipated, replaced by a new, unspoken reverence directed toward me. The final countdown had officially begun. The frivolous lawsuit was still pending, but it was nothing more than a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in his own face during the upcoming legal hearings. His flagship MedAxis event was an absolute freefall, actively hemorrhaging money and permanently destroying his remaining industry credibility. The commercial lenders and private investors were growing violently impatient, demanding immediate, concrete answers for the missing revenue and the chaotic public relations disaster unfolding before their eyes. The breaking point was approaching with terrifying speed. I could feel the intense pressure dropping in the atmosphere, signaling the final, massive explosion. But as I stood there in the ballroom, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water, I felt entirely at peace. When the shockwave finally hit, when the entire hollow facade of Beacon Row Live finally collapsed into rubble, absolutely no one would be able to place the blame on my shoulders ever again. The absolute collapse of Beacon Row Live did not happen in a loud, dramatic courtroom. It happened inside a sterile, heavily soundproofed conference room on the 44th floor of a neutral corporate law firm downtown. The catastrophic failure of the MedAxis Innovation Forum had triggered a massive financial panic, forcing an emergency mediation session. Sitting around the massive oak table were the commercial lenders, a furious group of private investors, the deeply unsatisfied MedAxis client representatives, and a very pale, visibly shaking Graham Pike. I was also there, sitting perfectly still next to my attorney, Evelyn. We had been formally invited by the investors, who demanded full transparency regarding Graham's pending lawsuit against Astor Loop Studio, as it represented a massive, undisclosed financial liability capable of tanking the entire agency. Graham genuinely believed he could spin his way out of the disaster. He opened his mouth, prepared to deliver another hollow monologue about market recalibrations and unforeseen logistical headwinds. But Evelyn did not let him speak. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened a thick black leather binder and began sliding printed documents across the polished wood surface. "Before we discuss the operational failures of the MedAxis event," Evelyn stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air, "we need to address the fraudulent foundation currently keeping this company afloat." She placed the first piece of paper directly in front of the lead commercial lender. It was the internal email Graham had sent, explicitly demanding his team reset my compensation before the lender call. The banker read it, his expression immediately hardening into stone. Evelyn then laid out the human resources audit logs, carefully pointing out the digital timestamps proving Graham had ordered his staff to fabricate negative performance reviews 48 hours after I had already formally resigned. My client, Juliana Walker, was never reprimanded for poor performance. Evelyn continued smoothly, her eyes locked on the investors. She was deliberately targeted because Mr. Pike needed an immediate, official reduction in overhead to secure his revolving credit facility. He used her flawless operational data to convince you to extend his loan, And then he stole exactly 50% of her salary to balance his own reckless vanity spending. Graham tried to interject, his voice cracking slightly, but the lead investor held up a hand, silencing him instantly. Evelyn was not finished. She produced the sworn legal deposition from Noah Baines. The former finance manager explicitly confirmed under oath that the executive salary reduction was a temporary cosmetic fix designed to deceive the lenders. He swore on the record that Graham had intentionally positioned me as the designated scapegoat for the inevitable financial collapse of the agency. The final fatal blow did not even come from my side of the table. The senior client representative for MedAxis leaned forward, his face flushed with pure anger. "We did not sign this massive contract because of Graham Pike," the MedAxis executive said, glaring directly across the table at Graham. "We signed because we were explicitly promised that Juliana Walker's operational frameworks would be utilized. Even after she left, your team repeatedly invoked her name, implying she had trained the new staff and left a foolproof system in place to guarantee our success. You used her past reputation to extend our trust, and you delivered an absolute, unmitigated disaster. We are formally terminating our contract for cause, effective immediately." The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The investors stared at Graham, completely disgusted. The commercial lenders looked at their legal counsel, silently calculating how quickly they could freeze the remaining financial assets. In that single, devastating moment, the entire narrative Graham had spent months aggressively building was entirely incinerated. The investors realized that he was not just a wildly incompetent operator who had ruined their flagship event. He had actively increased their legal and financial exposure by deliberately obfuscating my departure, lying to their largest clients, and committing outright corporate fraud to protect his own ego. The lead investor did not yell. He simply looked at Graham with cold, empty eyes. "Graham, you are hereby stripped of all executive operating authority. Effective right now. You will hand over your access credentials to our legal team before you leave this building. We will be taking immediate control of the board." As Graham sat there, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat, Evelyn quietly closed her binder. The multi-million-dollar lawsuit he had filed against Astor Loop and myself evaporated into thin air. The evidence presented in that room legally proved that clients were abandoning Beacon Row entirely due to a severe, verifiable decline in service quality, completely destroying his desperate claims of illegal poaching. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back to gloat. I did not need to see the expression on his face. The victory was not found in his destruction. It was found in my own absolute vindication. 10 minutes later, as I stood in the marble lobby waiting for the elevator, the heavy wooden doors of the mediation suite opened. Two of the primary Beacon Row investors walked out and approached me. They looked exhausted, carrying the heavy burden of a collapsed corporate portfolio. "Juliana," the older investor said, his tone carrying a new, profound level of respect, "we are going to liquidate the remaining assets and dissolve the current corporate structure. But there is still a core team of decent operational staff up there, and a few remaining contracts. We want to know if Astor Loop Studio would be interested in a structured buyout. We want to know if you want to take over the pieces and rebuild it. We can put you right in Graham's chair." It was the ultimate, poetic twist of fate. The universe was handing me the exact throne Graham had so jealously guarded for nearly a decade. I could walk back into that corner office, sit behind that massive mahogany desk, and rule over the ashes of the empire I had built and he had destroyed. I looked at the two men, offering them a small, polite smile. "No, Miyahao. Thank you," I replied firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but Astor Loop Studio is not interested in acquiring broken foundations. We build our own." I did not need to conquer his old kingdom to prove my worth. I was already building something infinitely stronger. At Astor Loop, I would continue to selectively hire only the people who truly respected the grueling, invisible labor of production. I would only accept the clients who willingly sought out our absolute transparency. I would continue to expand my own agency, fueled entirely by the exact same honest, relentless philosophy that had saved me from going down with his ship. When the elevator arrived, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy metal doors slid shut, I felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. Graham Pike genuinely thought that cutting my salary in half was the perfect way to finally put me in my proper place. Yet on that very day, he recklessly severed the final critical lifeline keeping his entire company afloat. He orchestrated his own complete and absolute ruin, and Juliana Walker walked out of the rubble, no longer a humiliated, invisible employee, but a woman who had finally, undeniably understood the true, immense weight of her own value. Thank you for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.